In the dim twilight of the medieval world, where kingdoms rose and fell by sword and scripture, something else moved in the shadows. Not armies, not kings, but whispers. Whispers of groups, hidden, silent, persistent. They met in candlelit rooms, deep within forests, or beneath cathedrals built from stone and secrecy. These were the earliest secret societies, not the grand conspiracies of modern imagination, but small, deliberate gatherings of people who knew that knowledge, if shared too openly, could kill. This is the story of how secret societies emerged in the Middle Ages, and more importantly, why kings feared them. Life in medieval Europe was brutally simple on the surface. Kings ruled by divine right. The church controlled the soul. The peasants toiled and obeyed. But beneath that order was tension, the constant pressure of curiosity, dissent, and survival. For those who wanted more freedom, more understanding, or more power, open rebellion was suicide. So they turned to secrecy. Imagine a scholar in 1100 AD. He has stumbled upon texts from ancient Rome or Greece, ideas that challenge the church's doctrine. If he speaks, he is a heretic. If he writes, he is damned. But if he finds others like him, quiet thinkers, cautious men and women who meet in secret, then he becomes part of something larger, a network, a society, not for power, at least not yet, but for survival. These groups were rarely organized in the way we imagine secret societies today. No grand halls or matching rings, no chants in Latin or robes of silk, just shared beliefs, shared fears, and slowly shared influence. A mason who knew the geometry behind Gothic arches, a monk who translated hidden texts, a merchant who carried forbidden manuscripts across borders. Each played a role in a quiet revolution the kings could barely detect, until it was too late. The fear didn't start immediately. At first, monarchs had bigger problems: Viking raids, plagues, constant wars with their neighbors. A group of scholars whispering in the corners of monasteries wasn't worth their notice. But as time passed, strange things began to happen. A castle collapsed, and rumors spread that it was sabotaged, not by enemies, but by insiders. A nobleman refused to pay his tithe to the church and claimed a higher truth. A region, once loyal, began questioning authority. And at the center of these ripples, always rumors of secret gatherings, always whispers of hidden knowledge. The church, for its part, was far quicker to panic. Knowledge to them wasn't just power, it was divine. And those who sought outside their authority were dangerous. The Inquisition wasn't born overnight, but grew rapidly once secret societies were suspected. Any deviation from orthodoxy was now suspect. Alchemy, astronomy, even philosophy, anything that smelled of ancient, non-Christian wisdom, was grounds for torture or death. Yet, the more they were hunted, the more these groups learned to hide. They developed codes, simple at first, like turning letters into numbers or using local dialects, then more complex. They met at night, in barns, in caves, in hidden rooms behind taverns. They passed books with false covers. They created symbols, strange ones, that could be etched in stone or sewn into clothes, invisible to outsiders but clear to each other. And most of all, they trusted, or tried to. The kings began to take notice not when societies themselves grew, but when their ideas spread. It wasn't just about secret meetings anymore. It was about questioning the divine right of monarchs, about laws created by consensus, not command, about wealth not granted by blood, but earned by knowledge. These were dangerous ideas in a world where hierarchy was everything. Consider England in the 13th century. The Magna Carta was not born in a vacuum. It was forced upon a king by nobles who were tired of absolute rule. But behind those nobles were thinkers, scribes, merchants, people who had been talking, planning, organizing, not openly, not always consciously, but connected, across borders. Secret knowledge was flowing. In Italy, in France, in the Holy Roman Empire, it was the same. Networks began to form, not always coordinated, but parallel. Brotherhoods of craftsmen who shared more than just trade secrets. Monastic orders who quietly studied ancient texts. Midwives who preserved herbal knowledge long outlawed by the church. These weren't just communities. They were threats, because they offered alternative systems of thought. And nothing terrifies a tyrant more than options. But not all secret societies were noble. Some were criminal, bandits who formed networks to rob and rebel, assassins who sold death, smugglers who moved goods and people and information. The lines blurred quickly. To a king, there was no difference. If it was hidden, it was dangerous. And so, repression followed. Edicts were passed. Books were burned. Suspects were tortured for names. Loyalty oaths were required. And yet, the societies adapted. They began using myths and stories to cloak their real purposes. A tale of a lost relic became a way to justify travel. A fictional brotherhood became a real one behind the scenes. Legends weren't just stories. They were smokescreens. What makes this time so fascinating is that we often think of secret societies as overly theatrical. But in the medieval world, secrecy was survival. It wasn't about drama. It was about not dying. And that made these people incredibly clever, incredibly cautious, and ironically very effective. By the 14th century, the effects were undeniable. Revolts were better organized. Heresies were spreading faster than ever. And worst of all, from the king's perspective, loyalty was no longer a given. People were asking questions. Dangerous questions. Why is the king chosen by God? Why must the church own the land? Why are we not allowed to read? And though kings had armies and laws, they lacked something crucial: trust. Because a secret society doesn't need to defeat a king in battle. It just needs to spread an idea. And ideas, once loose, are hard to kill. The fear of secret societies was not just about rebellion. It was existential. If a few peasants had gathered in a barn and plant the seeds of dissent, then the whole order of medieval life was at risk. Kings ruled by controlling the narrative. Secret societies wrote new ones in the dark. And so, this fear became obsession. Monarchs began to appoint spies. They paid informants. They tortured for confessions. In some cases, they invented societies that didn't even exist just to justify a crackdown. But all of this only made the idea of secret societies more seductive. If something is that feared, people reason, it must have power. The legacy of these early groups is hard to trace directly. They were, after all, secret, but their fingerprints are everywhere. In the early universities that began teaching dangerous subjects, in the guilds that protected workers' rights against noble abuse, in the early reformers who laid the groundwork for revolutions centuries later. Most were forgotten, their names lost, their codes unread, but their impact remains, because they proved something vital, that even in a world of kings and crosses, a few determined minds, working in silence, could shake the very foundations of power. And that is why they were feared. They began as humble protectors of pilgrims, sworn to chastity, poverty, and obedience. But within a century, the Knights Templar had become one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe. They wielded influence that rivaled kings, owned lands across continents, and were whispered to possess arcane knowledge and sacred relics. How did this transformation happen? Why did monarchs, once their allies, suddenly turn on them with brutal efficiency? And what secrets did the Templars carry into the flames? Our story begins in the aftermath of the First Crusade. Christian armies had captured Jerusalem in 1099, and a surge of European pilgrims began making the dangerous journey to the Holy Land. Robbers and bandits plagued the roads, and many travelers never made it. In response, a French knight named Hugues de Payens proposed a solution: a monastic order of warrior monks who would defend these pilgrims. With support from King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, the Knights Templar was born. At first, they were few, poor and dependent on donations. They were housed in part of Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque, believed to be the site of Solomon's Temple, hence their name. But their cause appealed deeply to Christian Europe. Protecting pilgrims was seen as holy work, and soon nobles began pouring money, land, and resources into the order. What made the Templars unique was their hybrid identity. They were both monks and soldiers. Bound by strict rules, they took oaths of chastity, poverty, and obedience. They wore distinctive white mantles with red crosses and followed a rigid code of conduct. But on the battlefield, they were fierce and disciplined, often forming the core of Crusader armies. Their success on the battlefield translated into influence off it. As the order grew, so did its wealth. They acquired vast tracts of land across Europe and the Holy Land. They built fortresses, managed farms, and ran businesses. But perhaps most significantly, they became bankers. The Templars were innovators in finance. Pilgrims could deposit money in one Templar location and withdraw it in another, a primitive form of the modern check. Kings and nobles began entrusting them with money and treasures. They offered loans, stored valuables, and facilitated international transactions. The order became immensely wealthy, yet because of their monastic vows, individual Templars were not supposed to own anything personally. All wealth belonged to the order. This financial power made them indispensable and dangerous. Monarchs who once supported the Templars began to view them with suspicion. The order had its own rules, answered only to the Pope, and could move money and men across borders. To kings struggling with debt, like Philip IV of France, the Templars were a tempting target. Philip's motivations were both personal and political. Deeply indebted to the Templars and eager to consolidate power, he launched a devastating campaign against them. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, hundreds of Templars in France were arrested. They were accused of heresy, idol worship, and blasphemy, charges based on confessions extracted under torture. The trials were brutal. Many Templars, loyal to the order, refused to confess and were burned alive. Others, broken by torture, admitted to bizarre and unsubstantiated claims. The order was eventually disbanded by Pope Clement V under pressure from Philip. Its leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were executed. The wealth of the Templars was seized or mysteriously vanished. But the destruction of the order only fueled the mystery. What secrets had the Templars guarded? Was there truth behind the rumors of hidden relics, like the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant? Had they discovered forbidden knowledge in Jerusalem? And where did their vast treasure go? Legends sprang up. Some claimed a group of Templars escaped and sailed to Scotland or the New World. Others believed they became the foundation for later secret societies, like the Freemasons. In time, the Templars became symbols, not just of religious zeal or military prowess, but of mystery and hidden power. What frightened kings most wasn't just the Templars' wealth or army. It was their autonomy. They answered to no crown. They held no loyalty to any kingdom. Their network transcended borders, and their unity gave them strength beyond numbers. In a time when power was supposed to flow from kings and popes, the Templars were a silent rebellion, a parallel system hiding in plain sight. To destroy them, kings used propaganda and fear. They twisted the very secrecy that protected the Templars into proof of guilt. If they met behind closed doors, it must be for dark rituals. If they hid their treasures, it must be because they worshipped false gods. The more silent the Templars were, the more loudly their enemies spoke. The Templar story is a cautionary tale. It shows how institutions born from noble intent can grow into something feared. It reveals how power, once outside the king's grasp, becomes intolerable. And it reminds us that history is written not only by the victors, but by those who survived the silence. Even today, the shadow of the Templars lingers. Their symbols appear in popular culture. Their myths fuel conspiracies. Their story has been retold in books, games, and films. But the truth, the full truth, remains elusive. What we do know is this. For a brief moment in history, a secretive group of warrior monks held the world in their grasp. And for that, the kings could never forgive them. The fear they inspired didn't end with their deaths. It lives on in the legends, in the questions we still ask, and in the power of a name that, centuries later, still makes us wonder. What did the Templars truly know? In the sun-drenched valleys of southern France, a quiet revolution once stirred. It was not born in palaces or fortresses, but in humble villages and wooded hills. Its followers were peasants, craftsmen, and nobles alike. They did not bear arms, nor did they seek crowns. But they held a belief so dangerous, so utterly at odds with the doctrines of power, that the medieval church declared them heretics, and the kings waged war to annihilate them. These were the Cathars. To the church, they were an existential threat. To the kings, they were a spark that could set fire to carefully ordered hierarchy of medieval society. But to many of the common people in the Languedoc region, there was something else entirely: guides, healers, and spiritual leaders who offer a vision of Christianity purer and more compassionate than anything Rome had given. The origins of Catholicism remain mysterious. Some historians trace their beliefs back to Eastern dualistic religions like Manichaeism or Bogomilism, which taught that the material world was inherently evil. Others argue that Cathar ideas developed organically in opposition to the corruption of the medieval church. Either way, by the 12th century, Catharism had taken deep root in the south of France, particularly in the counties of Toulouse and Carcassonne. At the heart of Cathar belief was a radical dualism. They taught that there were two gods: a good God who ruled the spiritual world, and an evil God who created the physical world. All material things, flesh, wealth, even the earth itself, were the domain of this dark power. Salvation, they believed, came through renunciation of material and a return to the spirit. This worldview had profound consequences. Cathars rejected the church's sacraments, its clergy, and its wealth. They denied the authority of the Pope and claimed that the Catholic Church had become the Church of Satan. They believed that Jesus was a spirit, not a man, and that his crucifixion was symbolic. To the church hierarchy, these beliefs were blasphemy of the highest order. But to many ordinary people, the Cathars' message was deeply appealing. While the Catholic Church built cathedrals and taxed the poor, Cathar perfects lived in poverty, traveling from village to village, healing the sick, preaching nonviolence, and offering spiritual guidance. They rejected war, refused to swear oaths, and insisted on equality of men and women in spiritual matters. This quiet revolution did not go unnoticed. The church initially tried persuasion. They sent missionaries and held debates. They even launched reforms to address some of the concerns the Cathars highlighted. But the Cathar movement kept growing. Towns were openly harboring Cathar perfects. Even some nobles had become protectors of the sect. Then, in 1208, the murder of the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau, allegedly by a knight loyal to the Count de Toulouse, gave Pope Innocent III the excuse he needed. The result was one of the most brutal campaigns in European history, the Albigensian Crusade. Unlike previous crusades, which targeted Muslims or pagans in distant lands, this one was waged on Christian soil, against Christian people. The church offered spiritual rewards for killing heretics, and thousands of knights from the north poured into the south. The war was not just against beliefs. It was a war of conquest, aimed at crushing an entire culture. The violence was unspeakable. In 1209, the town of Béziers was attacked. When soldiers asked how to distinguish heretics from Catholics, the papal legate reportedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Over 20,000 people were slaughtered. Town after town fell. Entire communities were wiped out. But still, the Cathars did not vanish. Many fled into mountains, hiding in caves and remote villages. They continued to preach and to live out their beliefs. The church responded with a new weapon, the Inquisition. The Inquisition was designed to root out heresy systematically. It relied on informants, secret testimony, and torture. Those accused were often denied any defense. Cathar perfects, when captured, were burned at the stake. Their followers were imprisoned or forced to wear humiliating yellow crosses. Despite this, the Cathars persisted for decades. The fortress of Montségur became a symbol of their resistance. Perched high on a rocky peak, it sheltered many of the remaining perfects. In 1244, after a lengthy siege, the fortress fell. Over 200 Cathars were given the chance to recant. They refused. They were marched into a field below the mountain and burned alive. This moment marked the end of Catharism as a visible movement, but it did not end the questions they raised. Why did their message resonate so deeply with people across class lines? Why did the church react with such disproportionate violence? And what, exactly, did the kings fear from this band of spiritual dissenters? The answer lies in the Cathars' challenge to the foundations of medieval power. They rejected hierarchy, questioned wealth, and denied the church's authority. They created an alternate community where compassion and simplicity were more valuable than titles and gold. In doing so, they exposed the moral bankruptcy of a system built on coercion and greed. Their teaching spread quietly through Europe even after their destruction, influencing later movements like the Waldensians and even the Protestant Reformation. And their memory lingered, inspiring stories, songs, and speculation. Some believe the Cathars guarded sacred knowledge, perhaps even the Holy Grail itself. Others see them as the first modern heretics, standing for spiritual freedom in a world of dogma and control. To the kings and popes of the Middle Ages, the Cathars were more than heretics. They were a mirror held up to power, a reminder that belief cannot be commanded, and that truth, once kindled, is hard to extinguish. Their fire may have been stamped out in the field below Montsegur, but its embers still glow in the minds of those who seek a faith unchained. In the heart of every medieval cathedral, hidden in the stone, is a message, not one written in ink, but carved in geometry, in sacred proportions and silence. These were the creations of the medieval stonemasons, men who shaped the soul of Europe, brick by brick, spire by spire. And yet, behind their chisels and compasses, behind the vaulted ceilings and flying buttresses, there was something more, a brotherhood, a system of knowledge passed hand to hand, eye to eye, one that would eventually become one of the most enduring and mysterious secret societies in the world, the Freemasons. But the origins of the Freemasons are not what most people think. There were no powdered wigs or American revolutions yet. Before the Enlightenment philosophers and founding fathers joined their lodges, there were the medieval Masons, the actual stone workers, skilled, mobile, and highly respected. They were unlike most other laborers. Their craft demanded mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and an understanding of sacred geometry. And in a time when literacy was rare, these men held knowledge that most nobles could only dream of. They traveled from site to site, building cathedrals that dominated the medieval skyline. These were not just buildings, they were symbols of divine power. But while kings and bishops claimed ownership of these monuments, the knowledge that made them possible belonged to the Masons. And knowledge, especially hidden knowledge, was always seen as dangerous. To protect their craft, the Masons formed guilds. At first, these were simply professional associations, ways to ensure fair wages, safety, and training. But soon they became more. The work they did wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The square, the compass, the level, these were tools, yes, but also metaphors. For truth, for balance, for equality. As the Masons built higher and reached further toward the heavens, they began to see their craft not just as labor, but as a spiritual journey. And so, they built rituals, initiation ceremonies, oaths of secrecy. They taught lessons not just in stone, but in virtue. And they protected this knowledge fiercely. Only those who proved themselves worthy, by skill, by character, by silence, were allowed into the inner circles. To a medieval king or bishop, this was unsettling. Here was a group of commoners, tradesmen, who shared ideas and symbols across borders, who answered to no lord but their own fraternity. They had no army, but they had networks. They had no throne, but they had influence. And worst of all, they didn't advertise their power. They hid it in plain sight. As the centuries turned, the nature of Freemasonry began to change. By the late Middle Ages, the great age of cathedral building was waning. Cities grew, literacy spread, and the Renaissance began to stir in Italy. The old operative masons, the ones who literally built with stone, were being replaced by speculative masons. Thinkers, philosophers, gentlemen who didn't work with their hands, but with ideas. They saw in Freemasonry a tradition of wisdom and moral teaching that could guide a new era. This was the Great Transformation. Freemasonry shifted from a guild of builders to a symbolic society of thinkers. Their lodges became places not of physical labor, but of philosophical exploration. They retained the symbols of the old craft, the square, the compass, the trowel, but reinterpreted them. The building of cathedrals became a metaphor for the building of the self. And with that change came new members, nobles, artists, scientists, even royalty. To the monarchs of the time, this shift was both a threat and a temptation. On one hand, here was a group that promoted ideas of equality, moral virtue, and brotherhood, all ideals that undermined the strict hierarchies of medieval rule. On the other hand, Freemasonry offered access to knowledge, influence, and secrecy, powerful tools in the hands of any ambitious king or advisor. And so the response was mixed. Some monarchs joined the lodges themselves, hoping to harness the Masonic network for their own ends. Others cracked down, suspicious of any group that operated beyond the crown's control. The Catholic Church was especially hostile. In 1738, long after the medieval period had ended but rooted in these same fears, Pope Clement XII issued a papal bull condemning Freemasonry. He accused the Masons of undermining the authority of the Church and of plotting in secret to overthrow the moral order. But these fears didn't begin in the Enlightenment. They had roots in the Middle Ages. Even then, whispers circulated about the Masons' strange rites, about their secret handshakes and oaths, about their loyalty to each other above all else. And when things went wrong, when cathedrals collapsed or towers cracked, some accused the builders of sabotage, of witchcraft, of heresy. What the kings feared was the Masons' autonomy. In a time when every guild, every church, every town answered to a lord or a bishop, the Masons moved freely. They carried their secrets from city to city, spoke a coded language, and lived by rules of their own making. And the more the kings tried to control them, the more elusive they became. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval Freemasonry is how little survives in the written record. This was an accident. The Masons operated in a time when writing down the wrong thing could lead to the stake. So they encoded their teachings in symbols, in architecture, in memory. They taught through allegory and metaphor. A stone arch wasn't just a physical structure. It was a lesson in unity, in balance, in faith. And while their records were sparse, their influence was immense. The great cathedrals of Europe, Chartres, Notre Dame, Cologne, are more than just churches. They are books in stone, filled with hidden geometry, astronomical alignments, and coded messages. Some of these designs are so complex that even modern engineers marvel at them. And at the heart of every one of them was a Mason, a man trained not just to carve stone, but to read the universe. This blend of craftsmanship and esotericism is what made the Freemasons so unique and so feared. They weren't just builders. They were guardians of tradition that reached back to the ancients. Some believe their knowledge came from Solomon's temple, or the pyramids of Egypt, or even Atlantis. Whether these stories are true doesn't matter. What matters is that the kings believed them. Because when power is fragile, even a rumor can be fatal. By the end of the Middle Ages, the seeds had been sown. Freemasonry had moved from the physical to the philosophical. It had attracted thinkers, rebels, and reformers. It had survived suppression, co-optation, and exile. And it had become something more than a guild. It had become an idea, one that couldn't be burned or banished. In the centuries to come, this idea would take on new forms. It would inspire revolutions, shape constitutions, and provoke countless conspiracies. But its roots, quiet, humble, hidden in stone, were forged in the medieval world. And that world, ruled by kings and bishops, could never fully contain it. The legacy of the medieval Freemasons is not just in their buildings. It's in the fear they inspired, the questions they raised, and the knowledge they preserved when the world wasn't ready for it. In the shadowy forests and isolated hills of medieval Europe, far from the stone cathedrals and royal courts, another kind of power endured. It was older than the church, older than the kingdoms themselves. It moved quietly through whispered chants, herbal brews, and moonlit rituals. And though it lacked armies or thrones, it was feared deeply by those who ruled, because this power belonged not to kings, but to women, to healers, to midwives, to pagans, to the so-called witches who carried the old ways in their blood and bones. The official story of medieval Europe is one of Christian dominance. The church, backed by monarchs, claimed authority over body and soul. They declared the old gods dead and the old practices heretical. But belief doesn't die so easily. Beneath the surface, especially in the countryside, pagan traditions survived. The rituals of the harvest, the veneration of nature, the use of herbs for healing, these were not easily erased. They simply went underground. And so, secret groups formed, not always formal, not always organized, but bound by shared knowledge and silence. Women, in particular, passed down this wisdom in hidden ways, from mother to daughter, from midwife to apprentice. They knew which plants could ease childbirth and which could end it. They understood the phases of the moon and the turning of the seasons. They kept the festivals of the old gods beneath new Christian names. To the church, this was dangerous. To kings, it was treasonous, because power in any form must be centralized to be controlled. And these covens, scattered, decentralized, rooted in folk knowledge, represented a kind of resistance. They answered to no bishop. They feared no king. They met in forests, not cathedrals. Their altars were rivers and trees, not marble and gold. And so they became targets. The church called them witches. It accused them of consorting with demons, of casting spells, of flying through the night. The truth was often far simpler and more threatening. They were midwives who saved lives, healers who challenged the monopoly of male doctors, wise women who carried the memory of a time before Christendom. And the rulers couldn't tolerate that. In the 13th century, the Inquisition began to turn its eye toward these women. Initially created to root out heresy among Christian sects, the Inquisition expanded its reach. Rumors of witches, of nighttime gatherings, strange symbols, unexplainable events were taken seriously. What had once been tolerated or dismissed became criminalized. And as fear grew, so did the violence. By the late Middle Ages, witch hunts had begun in earnest. They weren't yet the mass panics of the early modern period, but the seeds were sown. Torture extracted confessions. Trials, often based on hearsay, led to burnings. The accused were mostly women, poor, old, widowed, or simply different. And the charge was not just witchcraft. It was rebellion against the church, against the crown, against the order of the world. But these so-called witches were not solitary figures. They belonged in networks. Informal though they were, they shared knowledge across regions. Some gathered at sacred sites on solstices and equinoxes. Some preserved ancient deities under Christian saints' names. Some formed loose covens, circles of trust and ritual. Their secrecy was their shield and their curse. Because in a world ruled by fear, secrecy breeds suspicion. What frightened the kings most was not just that these groups existed, but that they persisted. Despite laws, despite executions, despite excommunications, they endured. Their survival spoke to something deeper, a longing for connection to the natural world, a sense of magic outside the rigid structures of church and crown, a different kind of power, one that didn't need swords or taxes, one that couldn't be seized, only shared. Some monarchs tried to co-opt this power. They declared certain healers cunning folk, authorized by the state, while condemning others as witches. But it was a losing battle. Folk belief doesn't obey borders. Magic doesn't follow laws. And so, the persecution continued. One of the most fascinating aspects of this hidden world is how much it influenced culture. Many fairy tales and folk stories, from Hansel and Gretel to Snow White, contain echoes of the witch trials, the evil crone in the woods, the poison apple, the secret knowledge. These stories were warnings, yes, but also memories. They preserved, in twisted form, the truth that once women held power and were punished for it. There were men, too, folk magicians, astrologers, alchemists, who walked this line. But it was women who bore the brunt. Because in medieval society, a powerful woman was an anomaly, a threat, and if she could heal, she could also harm. If she knew the secrets of life, she might also know the secrets of death. That fear was enough to justify fire. Yet even as they burned, the knowledge survived. In coded recipes, in lullabies, in charms whispered over wounds, in symbols etched into cottage doors. It moved quietly like a stream under ice, waiting, and eventually it would resurface in later movement of spiritual revival, in modern witchcraft, and in the still beating heart of folk culture across Europe. What kings feared most wasn't devil worship. It was independence. It was a worldview that didn't center on them, one that honored the earth, the seasons, the sacred feminine, one that whispered that power could be shared, not imposed. That healing could come without permission. That truth could exist outside their grasp. And so, they struck out in fear. But fear, like fire, only spreads what it tries to destroy. In dimly lit chambers filled with the scent of sulfur and ink, a strange kind of magic took root in medieval Europe. It was a magic not of spells and cauldrons, but formulas, symbols, and transmutations. It whispered of turning lead into gold, of eternal life, of hidden truths beneath physical matter. It was a world of alchemy, a blend of mysticism and science, secrecy and revelation. And at its heart stood the Rosicrucians, a mysterious brotherhood that claimed to hold ancient wisdom far beyond the reach of kings and priests. To understand why medieval rulers feared this world, we have to understand its promise. Alchemy wasn't just chemistry in disguise. It was a worldview. Alchemists believed that all matter contained spiritual essence, that transformation on the physical plane, like changing lead into gold, reflected spiritual transformation within the self. Their laboratories were as much sanctuaries as science rooms. Their work was part experimentation, part meditation. In a time when the church dictated the boundaries of knowledge, this was dangerous. Alchemists did not seek approval from bishops or kings. They followed their own symbols, their own texts, many of which were coded or written in obscure languages to avoid persecution. Secrecy was necessary, not just because of political repression, but because they believed that true knowledge could not be handed to the unprepared. Wisdom, like gold, had to be earned. The rise of alchemy in Europe had roots in the ancient world. It drew from Egyptian, Greek, and later Islamic traditions. Arabic scholars preserved and expanded upon alchemical knowledge during the Islamic Golden Age, and their texts filtered into Europe through Spain and Italy. Names like Jabir ibn Hayyan and Avicenna were revered, but as this knowledge spread, it blended with Christian mysticism. By the High Middle Ages, a distinctly European form of alchemy had emerged, deeply symbolic, quasi-religious, and obsessed with the philosopher's stone. The philosopher's stone was not merely a tool to turn metal into gold. It was believed to grant immortality, perfect wisdom, and enlightenment. To possess it was to transcend the limits of humanity. In a world where monarchs ruled by divine right, such an idea was heretical. If a man could achieve godlike knowledge or eternal life without the church or the crown, what place did kings have? It was from this philosophical soil that the Rosicrucian movement bloomed. The Rosicrucians appeared in the early 17th century, but their origins reached further back, steeped in myth. They claimed descent from Christian Rosenkreuz, a legendary figure who had traveled to the East and returned with secret knowledge. In the early 1600s, anonymous manifestos like the Fama Fraternitatis and the Confessio Fraternitatis began to circulate across Europe. They spoke of a hidden brotherhood dedicated to enlightenment, healing, and spiritual alchemy. But who were the Rosicrucians really? No one knew, and that made them even more feared. These manifestos called for a reformation, not just of religion, but of all knowledge. They criticized corruption in the church and blindness in science. They hinted at a coming age of light and wisdom, one not ruled by monarchs but by sages. And though they offered no names, their calls spread like wildfire. Scholars, mystics, and freethinkers across Europe sought the brotherhood, or claimed to be part of it. Whether the Rosicrucians existed as a real group or a philosophical idea, their influence was real and subversive. For rulers, this was deeply unsettling. Secret societies with secret knowledge, hidden networks of scholars who defied dogma, ideas that spread without armies. The Rosicrucians, like the alchemists before them, moved through the cracks in the system. They couldn't be taxed. They couldn't be arrested en masse. And worst of all, they didn't want political power. They wanted something higher. Alchemists and Rosicrucians shared a belief that truth was hidden, and only the worthy could uncover it. Their writings were dense with metaphor, lions devouring suns, kings drowning in mercury, trees growing upside down. To the uninitiated, it was gibberish. To those with eyes to see, it was a map to enlightenment. But what terrified monarchs most was that this map didn't include them. They were no longer the center of a universe. In fact, they might be the obstacle to human progress. Many monarchs did try to control alchemy. Some patronized alchemists, hoping for gold or elixirs of life. Others outlawed the practice entirely. Queen Elizabeth I had John Dee, a famed alchemist and occultist, as her advisor. Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire filled his court with alchemists and mystics. Yet even when embraced, the practice eluded control. Alchemists answered to no one but their own vision, and often they vanished just as quickly as they appeared, leaving only symbols and whispers behind. The church, too, grew wary. Alchemy bordered on blasphemy. Its rituals resembled prayer. Its texts replaced scripture. And the Rosicrucians, by advocating a universal spiritual brotherhood, threatened the monopoly of Christian salvation. If truth could be found within, if each soul contained a divine spark, what need was there for church or crown? That question was the silent revolution, not in the streets, but in the mind, not with swords, but with symbols. The alchemists and Rosicrucians did not storm castles. They wrote books. They drew diagrams. They hid truths in plain sight. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for future revolutions. The Enlightenment, the rise of science, the fall of monarchies. Their legacy lingers. Modern science owes more to alchemy than most care to admit. Psychology owes much to its symbols, as seen in the work of Carl Jung. And secret societies inspired by the Rosicrucians still exist, claiming to hold esoteric wisdom passed down through the centuries. But what remains most powerful is their defiance. In an age when kings held absolute power, when heresy meant death, when conformity was law, they dare to say, there's another way. There is hidden knowledge. There is truth outside the throne. And for that, they were hunted, ridiculed, and erased from official histories. Yet their flame never died. It flickers still in old manuscripts, in coded symbols, in the curious minds of those who seek more than what they are told. In the next chapter, we descend deeper into the world of guilds and worker brotherhood. In the early shadows of 19th century Europe, a secret network moved silently beneath the cobbled streets and candlelit salons. They were known as the Carbonari, a brotherhood born not in palaces, but in the smoky corners of taverns, blacksmith shops, and hidden lodges. Their name, derived from the Italian word for charcoal burners, was no accident. Like their namesake, they worked in the dark, shaping the fires of revolution beneath the surface of an empire that feared them. The Carbonari weren't just rebels. They were idealists cloaked in secrecy. They believed in a future where monarchs no longer ruled by divine right, and where constitutions, not kings, shaped a nation's destiny. But they also understood the dangers of dreaming too loudly. In an age when dissent could cost you your life, they wore massive obedience in the daylight and plotted freedom in the moonlight. Their roots, some say, stretch back to the Freemasons. Others whisper of even older bloodlines. Templars, Gnostics, ancient heretics driven underground by centuries of persecution. What is known is that by the early 1800s, the Carbonari had spread like wildfire across Italy and France, moving in cells so tightly knit that even members didn't always know one another's names. Their meetings were rituals cloaked in symbolism, forest-themed codes, oaths taken in candlelight, and passwords that echoed through hidden chambers. Novices were called apprentices, and elders were called masters. The Carbonari didn't just train fighters, they trained believers. Revolution, to them, was not just a battle, it was a holy calling. And Europe trembled. Governments called them traitors, heretics, anarchists. But to the common people, the Carbonari were something more: hope. As Napoleon's empire collapsed and the old monarchies clawed back power, the Carbonari saw their moment. In 1820, they lit the match in Naples, demanding a constitution and driving the king to concede. For a brief moment, the dream seemed real, but the fire they started would soon face storms from all sides. Still, they endured, not as a unified army, but as a movement that inspired others. The revolutions of 1830, the uprisings of 1848, even the unification of Italy under Garibaldi. Many who carried the torch of liberty had once sat in Carbonari lodges, swearing oaths under flickering candlelight, pledging their lives to an idea. They were hunted, tortured, and exiled. Yet even as the brotherhood faded, its spirit refused to die. The Carbonari were more than men. They were a memory, a myth, a movement that echoed through time, reminding the world that sometimes the darkest places are where the brightest fires begin. By the time 1821 arrived, the the Carbonari had already become a symbol of defiance. Across the Italian states, uprisings continued to flare like sparks on dry grass. In Piedmont, young officers and intellectuals conspired to overthrow Austrian-backed rule. They hoped to establish a constitutional monarchy, one that would answer not to Vienna, but to the people. Among them was a young lieutenant named Santori di Santa Rosa, a nobleman by birth. He turned against the old order to fight for something greater: unity, freedom, and the Italian identity. But their efforts, like those in Naples, were crushed. The Austrians descended once more, stamping out rebellion with cold efficiency. Santa Rosa fled to exile, but his name lived on, whispered in lodges and scrawled on prison walls. As repression tightened, the Carbonari adapted. They became more secretive, more symbolic. Initiations grew increasingly elaborate. A new member might be blindfolded, led through winding paths, and made to kneel before a makeshift altar. There, an elder would present a sword, a loaf of bread, and a cup of wine, symbols of struggle, survival, and sacrifice. Then came the oath, a solemn promise to defend liberty, to fight tyranny, and to never betray the order. To do so meant death, not just of the body, but of the soul. Their lodges were hidden in plain sight. Some met in barns or rural shacks. Others disguised themselves as religious brotherhoods or artisan guilds. They communicated through symbols carved into doors or left in chalk on alley walls. A branch, a triangle, a bundle of sticks. To the unknowing, meaningless. To the initiated, a message. And the message was always the same: resist. Meanwhile, the Carbonari's ideas were traveling faster than their names. In France, young radicals took inspiration from the Italian lodges. In Spain, rebels used similar tactics to rise against royal absolutism. Even in the Americas, echoes of the Carbonari could be found in independence movements fueled by secret societies and revolutionary zeal. But with expansion came danger. Not all who claimed the name Carbonari were true to the cause. Some sought power, others personal revenge. Splinters formed, betrayals happened. Infiltration by police informants grew common. One of the most infamous cases came in 1825, when the Papal States uncovered an extensive Carbonari plot to overthrow the Pope's authority. Dozens were arrested, trials were swift, executions followed. And yet, the Carbonari persisted. In 1831, a fresh wave of revolts erupted in central Italy. Cities like Bologna and Modena declared themselves free republics. Provisional governments were formed. Flags were raised. People cheered. But again, Austria intervened. The dream collapsed in weeks. The cycle repeated. Hope, uprising, repression. But each time, something remained, a spark that refused to die. By the 1840s, a new generation of revolutionaries had risen. Among them, Giuseppe Mazzini, a former Carbonaro. He had grown disillusioned with the society's secrecy and lack of coordination. He founded Young Italy, an open movement that called for national unity through mass education and uprising. Though different in method, his vision carried the same flame lit decades before in smoky Carbonari lodges. Mazzini's influence grew. His ideas spread across Europe. And when the revolutions of 1848 exploded, from Paris to Vienna to Milan, many saw it as the culmination of years of underground struggle. In Italy, revolution swept through the peninsula. For a time, even Rome declared itself a republic. The Pope fled. Garibaldi, the soldier of two worlds, returned to lead the fight. And behind many of these moments stood former Carbonari, aged now, scarred but unwavering. Though the Carbonari as an organization began to fade after 1848, their legacy was undeniable. They had laid the foundation for modern Italy. Their symbols, their rituals, their dreams had taken root in the minds of a people who had long been divided. And in 1861, when the Kingdom of Italy was finally proclaimed, many saw it not as a beginning, but as a vindication. The Carbonari had lost battles, but in the end, they helped win a war. Today, their name may not echo as loudly as the Freemasons or the Illuminati, but in the dark chapters of resistance, in the hidden pages of revolutionary history, the Carbonari burned bright. They remind us that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with armies or speeches, but in silence, in secrecy, in the hearts of those willing to risk everything for freedom. They remind us that even the smallest flame, when protected with faith and courage, can ignite the world. In the barren, wind-carved mountains of Persia, in the 11th century, a new shadow crept across the land, one born not of armies or empires, but of whispers, daggers, and belief. They were called the Assassins. But this was no myth. This was no story. The Assassins were real. Known formally as the Nizari Ismailis, they emerged in a time of turmoil. The Islamic world was splintered. Caliphates waged war on each other. Crusaders marched from Europe. And in this chaos, a man named Hassan al-Sabah envisioned a force unlike any the world had seen. From a mountaintop fortress of Alamut, hidden deep within the Elburz range, Hassan built more than just a military base. He forged a belief system, a way of life, a cult of absolute loyalty. The Assassins were not a traditional army. They were few in number, but their reach was vast. Their weapon wasn't brute force. It was fear, precision, sacrifice. They trained their minds as fiercely as they trained their bodies. They were scholars and warriors, philosophers and executioners. And above all, they were invisible. Stories of their exploits spread like wildfire. A king stabbed in the night, a general found dead in his tent, a dagger placed gently on his chest. Always silent, always sudden, always devastating. Their targets weren't chosen at random. The Assassins went after power, those who threatened their sect or their people. Sultans, viziers, even crusader commanders. No fortress was too strong, no protection too great. If you stood against them, you never slept soundly again. But how did Hassan create such a force? According to legend, and legend swirls around the Assassins like mist, Hassan would initiate recruits through elaborate rituals. It's said that he would give them visions of paradise, gardens filled with flowing rivers, music, and houris, a glimpse of heaven, achieved not in death, but through loyalty. Was it drug-induced illusion? Was it devotion? Perhaps both. But the effect was undeniable. These men would do anything for their master, leap from walls, face impossible odds, smile in the face of certain death. To the outside world, they were monsters. To their followers, they were martyrs. The name assassin itself comes from Hashishin, possibly a slur used by their enemies. Whether it meant users of hashish or simply outcasts, it stuck. And over time, it became synonymous with silent killers who struck from the shadows. But the truth, as always, was more complex. The Nizari Ismailis were a branch of Sharia Islam. They sought spiritual enlightenment, political autonomy, and survival in a hostile world. Surrounded by enemies, secrecy became their shield, subtlety their sword. Their fortress at Alamut became more than a military bastion. It was a university, a library, a sanctuary for those who believed knowledge was as powerful as any blade. Hassan al-Sabah ruled with intellect and discipline. He was known to copy books by hand, to study astronomy, to debate theology, and his followers mirrored his intensity. They saw themselves not as murderers, but as instruments of divine justice. For nearly 2 centuries, the Assassins held their ground. They built a network of mountain fortresses across Persia and Syria. Their leaders, the Dayas, coordinated missions with terrifying efficiency. Even the mighty crusaders feared them. It's said that Richard the Lionheart once considered allying with the Assassins. Better to have them as friends than as foes. And when the great Saladin rose to power, he too became their target. In one failed attempt, the Assassins penetrated his camp, left a blade and a note in his tent, and vanished. A warning, a signature, a message: we can reach you. But power breeds enemies. And by the mid-13th century, a new storm was rising. The Mongols, led by Hulagu Khan, they swept through Persia with unmatched brutality. They burned cities, toppled dynasties, and in 1256, they turned their gaze toward Alamut. The Assassins resisted, but the tide of history was too strong. Alamut fell, its libraries burned, its walls crumbled, the Brotherhood shattered, or so it seemed. The assassins never truly vanished. They survived in whispers, in exile, in legend. Their descendants, the modern Azari Ismailis, continued their faith, guided by a line of imams who still exist today. But the myth of the assassin, took on a life of its own. Europeans brought back tales of their terrifying precision. Writers transformed them into symbols of danger and mystery. Centuries later, novels, films, and video games would resurrect their name, painting them as eternal warriors in a war fought from the shadows. And though the real assassins were far more than killers, philosophers, visionaries, protectors, the shadow remained. They became a symbol of resistance, of fear, of the power of belief, a whisper in the dark, a blade in the night, a name spoken in fear and awe. The assassins, real and unforgettable. They were not just men. They were an idea. And ideas, as history has shown, never die. In the faded twilight of Enlightenment Europe, where kings still rule by divine decree and the church casts long shadows over science and reason, a secret order stirred in the hidden corners of academia and political salons. They called themselves Illuminati, the Enlightened Ones. But what they sought was not power for its own sake. They sought illumination, the light of reason, freedom, and truth in an age mired in superstition and tyranny. The year was 1776, and in the Bavarian city of Ingolstadt, a professor named Adam Weishaupt laid the foundation of a movement that would, in time, become legend. Weishaupt was a scholar disillusioned with the rigid control of the Catholic Church and the suffocating grip of monarchies. He envisioned a new world, one governed by rational thought, ethical science, and secular morality. To achieve this, he founded the Order of the Illuminati. It began with just 5 men, educated, idealistic, radical. They met in secret, swearing oaths of loyalty not to a nation, but to an idea, that knowledge must be liberated and ignorance destroyed. Like the Freemasons, whose lodges they often infiltrated, the Illuminati cloaked their intentions in symbols and rituals. But unlike the Freemasons, their mission was explicitly revolutionary. They called themselves the perfectibilists, believers in the perfectibility of mankind, and their goal was nothing short of the transformation of society itself. They recruited carefully, moving in shadows. Lawyers, scientists, poets, nobles, even priests joined their ranks. Many didn't even know who truly led them. Cells operated independently. Secrets were passed mouth to ear, symbol to symbol, to ensure that no betrayal could destroy the whole. They opposed religious oppression. They opposed the monarchy. They believed that through education, equality, and reason, humanity could ascend to its highest form. But the world was not ready. Their ideas spread fast, and so did fear. In just 10 years, the Illuminati expanded across German-speaking Europe, embedding themselves in universities, courts, and even royal circles. Rumors flourished. Who were they really? What did they want? Whispers claimed they pulled strings behind revolutions, that they wrote constitutions in the dark, that they had infiltrated every major power. By 1785, the Bavarian government had had enough. The Illuminati were declared illegal. Edicts were issued, homes raided, letters seized, members imprisoned. And so, officially, the Illuminati vanished. But that was just the beginning of the myth, because you cannot ban an idea. Long after their supposed dissolution, the Illuminati lived on in the imagination of the world. Conspiracy theorists would claim they were behind the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, even the founding of the United States. Every act of rebellion, every cry for equality or liberty, somehow echoed with the whispered name Illuminati. Writers and thinkers added fuel to the fire. Secret handshakes, hidden symbols, the all-seeing eye, the pyramid, the number 13, all became pieces of a sprawling puzzle whose edges no one could see. And in time, the Illuminati became something else entirely. They became a symbol of the unknown forces shaping history. Were they puppeteers behind the curtain, or scapegoats for the chaos of progress? Were they freedom fighters or tyrants in disguise? The truth is more elusive. Weishaupt died in exile, denouncing the more extreme stories as fantasies. But his dream, that of a world awakened by knowledge, did not die. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, secret societies continued to emerge. Some carried the Illuminati's banner. Others simply echoed their ideals. Revolutions flared across Europe and the Americas. Monarchies fell. The old world crumbled, piece by piece. And in every revolution, in every whisper conspiracy, the name returned. The Illuminati. They've been blamed for global wars, for financial collapses, for technological breakthroughs and pandemics. Some say they control Hollywood. Others claim they run governments, banks, even space agencies. Most of it is fiction. But fiction, like faith, carries power. Because Illuminati, real or imagined, represents something primal in the human soul. The fear of being controlled, and the hope that someone, somewhere, understands what's really going on. In a world of chaos, the idea of a secret order pulling the strings gives comfort to some and terror to others. And so the legend grows. From shadowy corners of YouTube videos to the pages of best-selling novels, from whispered rumors in classrooms to late-night talks in smoky bars, the Illuminati persist, not as men, not as names, but as a myth rooted in a real brotherhood that dare to challenge the darkness with light. They remind us that the most powerful revolutions don't always begin with guns or armies. Sometimes they begin with a question: what if we could be free? And that question, once asked, cannot be unasked. The Illuminati were hunted, suppressed, ridiculed, but their spark ignited a fire that still burns, in books, in minds, in movements. A fire that reminds us the pursuit of truth is itself a rebellion, and the ones who seek it, no matter how secret or small, may yet change the world.